Jiho stood in the grand hall of the Galactic Assembly and felt very small. The ceiling stretched so high above him that clouds formed near the top. Around him sat representatives from 47 different alien species. Some had scales, some had fur, some looked like floating gas clouds, some were so strange that Jiho's brain hurt trying to understand their shape. He was the only human in the room. Earth had joined the Galactic Assembly only 3 months ago. Other species had debated for years about whether humans were smart enough to join. Many voted no. They said humans were too violent, too primitive, too young, but the vote passed by just 3 votes, and now Jiho represented all of humanity in this massive station that orbited a star halfway across the galaxy from Earth. Today's meeting was supposed to be routine. Budget reports, trade agreements, boring stuff that made Jiho wish he could go home and eat his mother's cooking instead of the tasteless nutrition paste the station provided. But then they entered the hall and everything changed. They looked like giant mantis insects, but with softer edges and skin that shimmered with colors that G had no names for. They moved slowly, their legs trembling. Their leader, Elder Vale, needed help from 2 younger just to reach the speaking platform. The hall fell silent. Even the species that communicated through radio waves stopped their constant buzzing. "We are dying," Elder Valak said. His voice came through Jiho's translation devices, soft and sad. "Our star collapses. Our biology fails. We have perhaps 3 weeks before the last of us perishes." Gasps echoed through the hall. They had been part of the assembly for 12,000 years. They were one of the oldest species, one of the wisest. "We have prepared gifts," Elder continued, "for species that showed us kindness, for species that helped us in dark times, for species we believe will carry our memory forward." Large boxes materialized in front of various delegates. The Krovan received a box, the Altani received one, the Wexim, the Prel, the Salani, 10 species in total received gifts from the dying, and then one appeared in front of Jiho. He stared at it. The box was made of some kind of crystal that seemed to contain starlight. It hummed softly, a sound that made him think of his grandmother singing him to sleep when he was small. "Humanity," Elder Velek said, and every eye in the hall turned to Jiho. "You are young, so young. You have been in the stars for less than 1 human lifetime. You have known us for mere weeks, yet we watched you for longer. We studied you, and we give you our greatest treasure." An alien delegate from the Krovan stood up, his forearms waving angrily. "This is madness. The humans are barbarians. They still have wars on their own planet. They cannot be trusted with Vani heritage." Other voices joined in. "They're too primitive. They'll destroy it. They don't deserve such an honor." Elder Velek raised one thin arm for silence. "The Archive of Eternal Memory contains 800,000 years of achievement. Our art, our music, our literature, our science, our philosophy, our dreams and hopes and fears, everything we were, everything we knew. It is the soul of our species preserved forever." He turned his large multifaceted eyes toward Jiho. "We give this to humanity because we watched how they treat gifts other species preserve. They lock treasures in museums protected behind glass, never to be touched or changed. This is respectful, yes, but it is also death. Different kind of death." The Ellers's voice grew stronger. humans do not. Waste, they take old things and make them new. They take broken things and fix them. They take gifts and they use them. They do not let anything die if they can help it. This is what we need. Not preservation, not a museum. We need someone who will keep us alive. Ji stood slowly, his hands shook, his heart pounded so hard he thought everyone in the hall could hear it. He walked to the crystal box and placed both hands on its surface. It felt warm, like touching another person's hand. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. I don't know if we deserve this honor, but I promise you, Elder Vale, I promise you on behalf of all humanity, we will not let your people be forgotten. We will not lock this away. We will learn from it. We will share it. We will keep you alive in the only way we know how, by making your culture part of ours. Tears ran down Jiho and LT Unk and GT face. He didn't try to hide them. In human culture, tears at such a moment were not weakness, they were proof of how much something mattered. Elder Velk approached him slowly. The ancient being reached out and touched Geo and LT Unk and GT's wet cheek with one delicate claw. You cry for us, for strangers you barely know. This is why we chose correctly. The other species who received gifts made formal speeches. They thanked the Vani with proper words and diplomatic phrases. They promised to build museums and monuments. They would preserve everything perfectly, unchanged forever. Jiho just stood there crying, holding the archive box like it was a child that needed protection. 3 weeks later, news reached the assembly. The last had died. Their son had collapsed into a black hole, taking their home planets with it. 800,000 years of civilization gone in a moment. The other species held memorial services. They placed their Vani gifts in special rooms with perfect temperature control and security systems. They would let no dust touch these precious artifacts. They would let no one damage these pieces of history. Jiho took the archive back to Earth. He placed it in a university in Seoul, in a room where thousands of people could come and study it, not behind glass, not locked away, right there where human hands could touch it, human eyes could read it, human hearts could learn from it. The other alien species sent angry messages. You're exposing it to danger. Someone might damage it. This is disrespectful. Jiho sent one message back to all of them. They didn't give us a museum piece. They gave us a responsibility, and humanity never wastes a gift. Within days, the room filled with scientists, artists, linguists, and students. They stared at the archive with wonder. They argued about what it meant. They made plans and took notes and started working. Galaxy watched and waited to see what humanity would do with the treasure of a dead species. They had no idea what was coming. Hana rubbed her tired eyes and looked at the symbols on her screen again. She had been staring at them for 6 hours straight. They still made no sense. This is impossible, said Suho, one of her fellow linguists. He threw his stylus down on the desk. We've been at this for 6 months. We can translate maybe 5% of the archive. At this rate, it'll take us 200 years to understand everything. Hana wanted to argue with him, but she couldn't. He was right. Thay language was like nothing humans had ever encountered. It wasn't just words, it was colors and sounds and feelings all mixed together. A single Vani word might be a shade of blue, combined with a specific musical note and a memory of wind. How could humans possibly translate that around them? 10,000 other researchers worked in the massive facility that had been built around the archive. People from every country on Earth had volunteered. They worked in shifts day and night trying to unlock the secrets of 800,000 years of alien knowledge, and they were failing. News had reached Earth about what the other alien species did with their Vanni gifts. The Krovan had built a beautiful museum. The Alani had created a memorial garden. The Sulani had locked their gift in a vault with temperature control and radiation shielding, all perfectly preserved, all completely unused. The Galactic Assembly sent messages to Earth every week. You should put the archive in a museum, they said. You're going to damage it by exposing it to so many people. You don't have proper preservation technology. You're being irresponsible. But Jiho, who had become Earth's permanent ambassador to the Assembly, always replied the same way. We're not trying to preserve it. We're trying to understand it. There's a difference. Hana understood that difference. Preservation meant keeping something safe but dead. Understanding meant bringing something back to life, even if it was hard, even if it seemed impossible. That evening, Hana attended a meeting with specialists from different fields. Duan, a neuroscientist, presented his research. I think I know why we can't translate the Anani language, he said, showing brain scans on the large screen. It's not about words, it's about how the brain processes information. They experience the world completely differently than we do. We already know that, said MJI, a frustrated artist who had been trying to recreate Vanni paintings. Their art uses colors we can't see. Their music uses sounds we can't hear. Their writing requires senses we don't have. Exactly, said, but what if we could teach our brains to process information more like theirs? Not change our biology, but train our neural pathways to make new connections. Everyone stared at him. You want to change how our brains work? Zhu Ho asked. Not change, expand, Duan explained. Humans already do this naturally. Musicians train their brains to process sound differently than non-M musicians. Artists see colors differently. Mathematicians think in patterns most people can't perceive. What if we could train people to think partly like Vanni? It sounded crazy. It sounded dangerous. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing humans would try. Within a month, Daewon had developed a training program. It used special visual displays, sound frequencies, and meditation techniques. It would take months of practice, several hours a day. It might not even work, and they had no idea if there would be side effects. We need volunteers, Hana announced to the research team. Every single person in the room raised their hand, all 10,000 of them. They started with a small group of 50 people, and I was one of them. For 3 hours every day, they sat in special rooms and let the training program rewire their neural pathways. They looked at colors that seemed wrong. They listened to sounds that made their teeth hurt. They practiced thinking in ways that felt unnatural. It was exhausting. Several people quit after the first week, more quit after the first month. But Hana noticed something changing in her mind when she looked at the symbols. Now they didn't seem quite as alien. She started to see patterns she couldn't see before. Sometimes just for a moment, a Vanni word would almost make sent not as a translation into Korean or English, but as a complete concept that included color and sound and emotion all at once. After 3 months of training, Hana sat down with the archive again. She opened a Vanny text at random, and suddenly she could read it. Not translate it, read it, understand it, feel it. She gasped and called day 1 over. It works. I can understand this. It's about the way morning light reflects off water, but also about the feeling of hope, and also about a mathematical equation that describes ripples, and it's all one word, one concept, one beautiful idea. She was crying again. She seemed to cry a lot these days, but she didn't care. News of the breakthrough spread through the facility like wildfire. The 50 volunteers who completed the training could now read basic texts. They started teaching others. The training program expanded. Soon 500 people could read Vanny, then 5,000, then 50,000 people lined up across Earth wanting to join the program. They didn't care that it was difficult. They didn't care that it took months. They wanted to learn. They wanted to understand. They wanted to know what the Galactic Assembly heard about the neural training program and sent shocked messages. You're modifying your own brains for a dead species. This is disturbing behavior. You should stop immediately. Why would you change yourselves for aliens you never even met? Geo read these messages in his office on the assembly station. He thought about how to respond. Finally, he sent one simple message back. The Vanny gave us their culture. The least we can do is learn to speak their language properly. But privately, he told Hana something different during their video call. They don't understand us, the other species. See the Vanny as dead. We see them as teachers we never got to meet. There's a big difference. Hana nodded. She was working on translating a Vanny poem. It was about flowers that grew on their home world, flowers that would never bloom again anywhere in the universe. The poem made her sad, but also grateful. Sad that the flowers were gone, grateful that someone had taken the time to write about them so they wouldn't be forgotten. I had a thought today, Hana said. Every species in the galaxy treats death the same way. They preserve, they memorialize, they lock things away. But humans, we've always believed the dead stay alive through us, through our memories, through our stories, through the things they taught us, and they understood that about us. Jiho said quietly. Yes, they knew we wouldn't just put their culture in a museum. They knew we'd make it part of ourselves. A year after starting the neural training program, the translation project had advanced more than anyone thought possible. 20% of the archive was now understandable. Hana's team was publishing papers, creating art, and sharing what they learned. And they discovered something wonderful. The Vanny had been kind, gentle, curious. They had loved beauty and learning. They had written poetry about ordinary things, like rain and friendship. They had created music that celebrated simple joys. They had been people in all the ways that mattered. Hana stood in front of the archive crystal one evening alone. In the quiet facility, she placed her hand on its warm surface. We're learning, she whispered to the dead species. We're listening, and we promise we won't stop until we understand everything you wanted to teach us. Crystal hummed softly as it always did, but somehow to Hana's newly trained brain the hum sounded almost like approval. Yuna stood on the stage and felt her heart racing. 50,000 people sat in the concert hall, another billion watched on screens across Earth, and somewhere out in the galaxy, alien species were watching too, curious about what the humans had done with their Vanny gift. She lifted her violin. Behind her, an orchestra of 200 musicians waited. They had practiced for 6 months for this moment. Tonight they would perform the first symphony ever played by human hands. The Anani had written this symphony 4,000 years ago. It was called The Color of Hope in the closest translation humans could manage. But that name didn't capture what it really meant. The actual title contained concepts about light passing through water, about the feeling of spring after a long winter, about mathematical harmonies that described the growth of flowers. Yuna had learned to understand these concepts. She had spent 2 years in the neural training program. Now when she read the Vanny musical notation, she didn't just see notes, she saw colors. She felt emotions. She understood the mathematics of beauty that the Vanny had discovered. She began to play. The music was strange. It used intervals that sounded wrong to human ears at first. But as the symphony developed, something magical happened. The wrong notes started to sound right. The unusual harmonies began to make sense. The alien rhythms became natural. By the end of the first movement, people in the audience were crying. By the end of the symphony, everyone knew they had experienced something that had never existed before, a perfect bridge between two species separated by 800,000 years and half a galaxy. The recording of that concert spread across Earth in hours. Within days, it had reached the Galactic Assembly. Within weeks, it had been downloaded 20 billion times by species across the galaxy. The aliens were stunned. They're playing Villani music, the Krovan delegate said in disbelief. But they're not Villani. They changed their own brains to understand it. Another delegate said, that's disturbing, but they kept listening. They couldn't help it. The music was too beautiful. Yuna became famous overnight. Reporters wanted to interview her. Other musicians wanted to learn from her, but she spent most of her time teaching. She created programs to help other humans learn to play Villani instruments, to understand musical theory, to feel the mathematics of composition. They discovered things about music that we never knew, she told her students. They understood that sound and color and emotion are all connected. They found patterns in harmony that match patterns in nature. We can learn from this. We can add it to human music and create something new. While Yuna worked with music, Taeyang worked with buildings. He was an architect who had spent 3 years studying Villani design principles. The Anani built their structures using mathematical equations that humans had never thought to apply to architecture. Their buildings weren't just functional. They were alive with patterns that made people feel calm, creative, and connected. Taeyang designed a new university building in Busausen using these principles. When it was finished, people who visited said it felt different from other buildings. They felt more relaxed there. They thought more clearly. Ideas came easier. Scientists studied the building and discovered that Taeyang had used Vanny mathematical harmonies in the proportions of every room, every window, every corridor. The building's dimensions created subtle resonances that affected human psychology in positive ways. The Vanny understood something we didn't. Tiang explained at A conference, they knew that spaces shape minds, they designed there. Buildings to make people better, kinder, smarter, more creative. We can do this. 2. We can take their knowledge and adapt it for human needs. Soon, architects across Earth were studying design principles. New buildings rose that combined human and aesthetics. They looked alien but felt welcoming. They were different but somehow right. In universities, students debated philosophy. They had spent thousands of years thinking about consciousness, meaning, and existence. Their conclusions were different from human philosophy but equally profound. In art studios, painters created works using color theory. The paintings used shades that shouldn't work together but somehow did, creating emotional effects that purely human art couldn't achieve. In laboratories, scientists applied mathematical discoveries to modern problems. They had found elegant solutions to equations that humans were still struggling with. Earth was experiencing a renaissance, not a human renaissance, a human renaissance, a mixing of two cultures into something new. The Galactic Assembly watched with growing unease. 2 years after the First Symphony, Ambassador Jiho was invited to deliver a major speech at the assembly. He spent weeks preparing. He worked with Hana, who had become Earth's leading scholar. I want to deliver part of the speech in Vani, he told her. She looked worried. The other species won't like that. They'll think you're being disrespectful. Humans speaking a dead language. It's not dead if we're speaking it, Jay said firmly. On the day of the speech, the Grand Hall was packed. Every species sent representatives. They wanted to hear what the humans had to say about their controversial use of the archive. G walked to the speaking platform. He looked out at the sea of alien faces. He took a deep breath. He began speaking in Korean, which his translator converted for the audience. He talked about what humanity had learned from the archive. He showed images of Yuna's concerts, Taeyong's buildings, the art and science and philosophy that humans had absorbed. Then he switched to the hall went silent. Translators struggled to convert his words, but they concepts Geo expressed had no equivalence in most languages. He was talking about ideas that only existed in philosophy, thoughts about the connection between learning and becoming, about how understanding another species changed you into something more than you were before. When he finished that section and switched back to Korean, he could see shock on every alien face. A Krovan delegate stood up. This is wrong. You're wearing their culture like a costume. You're playing pretend with the heritage of a dead species. Jiho shook his head. No, we're not pretending. We're continuing. There's a difference. What difference? Another delegate demanded. The Vellani gave their culture to us, not to preserve but to grow. We've learned their language. We've studied their art. We've absorbed their philosophy. And now we're creating new things with it. New music that combines and human styles. New architecture that uses their mathematics. New ideas that build on their philosophy. He pulled up images on the screen behind him. Look at this painting. A human artist created it, but she used Vellani color theory. Look at this equation. A human mathematician solved it using mathematical principles. Look at this building, this song, this poem. They're all new. They're all something that never created, but they wouldn't exist without. The They are dead, someone said coldly. You're just puppeting there. corpse, Jay felt anger flash through him. He fought to keep his voice calm. Voli are dead, but their ideas aren't. Their beauty isn't. Their wisdom isn't. We've taken what they gave us and we've kept it alive, not by locking it in a museum, not by preserving it untouched. By using it, by learning from it, by letting it change us. He gestured to the other delegates. You all received Vanny gifts too. What have you done with them? You built museums, beautiful museums, yes, respectful memorials, but empty ones, dead ones. You preserved the culture so perfectly that nothing can touch it, nothing can change it, nothing can grow from it. That's what you do. With a gift, you let it grow. The hall erupted in argument. Some species agreed with Jiho, younger delegates mostly. They had seen what humanity created and felt something stir in them, a question about whether perfect preservation was really the best way to honor the dead. But older, more conservative delegates were outraged. They accused humanity of gravarobing, of cultural theft, of disrespecting the deceased. Jiho let them argue. And GT, he had said what he needed to say. That night back in his quarters, he received a message from Earth. It was from Hana. We found something in the archive, she wrote, a file hidden deep in the cultural records. Jiho, I think you need to see this. She attached a document. Jiho opened it and started reading. His hands began to shake. The document was a prediction written by the Vanny elders. Thousands of years ago, they had predicted their species would die, and they had predicted what would happen. After they had known humanity would do exactly what it was doing, and they had wanted it this way. Nari walked into the classroom and smiled at her students. They weren't human students, they were young Krovan. Their forearms folded politely as they waited for the lesson to begin. Their parents had been horrified when they signed up for Nari's class, but the young Krovan were curious about what the humans had learned from the Vanny. Today, Nari said, we're going to learn about Vanny poetry. She had been teaching for 3 years now, traveling to different alien worlds and offering classes about Vanny culture. At first, only a few brave young aliens attended. But word spread. Now she had waiting lists months long. The young were always braver than the old. This poem is about water, Nari continued, displaying the symbols on the screen, but it's also about change in time and the way memory flows. Memory, the Villani didn't separate these concepts. To them, water and memory and time were all connected. A young Krovan raised one of her hands. My mother says it's wrong to study dead cultures like this. She says we should just remember them, not try to understand them. What do you think? Nari asked gently. The young Krovan hesitated. I think if we just remember them without understanding them, we only know that they existed. We don't know who they were. Nari nodded. That's a wise observation. Across the galaxy, similar conversations were happening. Young aliens watched what humans were doing and asked questions, hard questions, questions their elders didn't want to answer. The Alani had received ancient texts from a species called the Wrath, who died out 5,000 years ago. These texts sat in a museum untranslated. Group of young Alani asked the museum director, why haven't we translated them? We're preserving them, the director said, but how can we learn from them if we can't read them? The director had no good answer. The Sulani had received musical instruments from the Cree species, extinct for 8,000 years. The instruments sat in climate. Controlled cases, never touched, never played. A young musician asked, "What's the point of saving instruments if no one ever makes music with them?" "We're keeping them safe," her teacher said. Safe from what? From being used for their purpose. Again, no good answer. A movement began among the young of the galaxy. They called it the awakening. They questioned why their species locked away the gifts from dead civilizations. They asked why preservation meant no one could touch, study, or learn from these treasures. The older generation was deeply uncomfortable. This is the human influence, they said. Humans are corrupting our young with their disrespectful attitudes, but the young kept asking questions. "Mean you working as a human diplomat on the assembly station?" Found himself at the center of a growing storm. Conservative alien factions accused him of cultural contamination. They said humans were spreading dangerous ideas about how to treat heritage and memory. "You're grave robbers," one old Wexham delegate spat at him. "You dig up the past and parade it around like entertainment." Mean you kept his temper. "Though it was hard, we're not digging up anything, we're learning. There's a difference between respecting the dead by never touching what they left behind and respecting them by trying to understand what they wanted to teach. The dead want to rest in peace. The Vani didn't want peace. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their culture to continue. That's why they gave us the archive." The argument spread through the assembly. Progressive species supported the human approach. Conservative species demanded Earth be punished for cultural violations. Assembly fractured into factions, unable to agree on what counted as proper respect for extinct civilizations. Meanwhile, Hansel made a discovery. He was a historian working deep in the archive, studying the final years of Vani civilization. He found personal journals written by the Anini elders who decided where to send their cultural gifts, and he found their predictions. They knew, Hansel said to Hannah during an emergency video call. The Anani elders knew exactly what would happen. "Look at this entry." He shared his screen. "Hannah, read the translated text. We debated for years about who should receive the archive. The Krovan would protect it well, the Alani would honor it properly, the Sulani would preserve it perfectly. But protection, honor, and preservation are all forms of burial. We do not want a tomb, we want life. We studied the humans. They are young and violent and strange. Many of my fellow elders say humans are too primitive, too dangerous, but I have watched their history. I have seen what they do with gifts. They do not lock them away. They use them. They break them apart and put them back together in new ways. They take old ideas and make them new. This is what we need. The other species will preserve us like insects in amber, perfect and dead. Humans will take us apart and rebuild us. They will change us. They will add to us. They will mix us with their own culture until something new emerges. Some call this disrespectful. I call it immortality. Not the immortality of a perfect statue that never changes, the immortality of a river that flows forever, always moving, always becoming something new while still being itself. We are dying. Our species ends, but our ideas are art. Our ways of thinking, these can live forever if someone keeps them alive, not preserved, alive, growing, changing, continuing. I vote we give the archive to humanity. Let them tear it apart, let them question it, let them argue with our philosophy and remix our music and rebuild our mathematics, let them make mistakes with it, let them make it theirs, because if they make it theirs, then we become part of them, and as long as humanity exists, so will we. Hannah finished reading, tears streamed down her face. They planned this. They knew the other species would be angry. They knew humans would be criticized. They knew the galaxy would debate our approach. They wanted all of this to happen. Why? Hansel asked, though he thought he knew the answer. Because they wanted to wake the galaxy up. They wanted to challenge how everyone thought about death and memory and heritage. They knew if humans took a different approach, other species would start asking questions. She was right. They had seen their own death coming and decided to use it as a final gift, not just to humanity but to the entire galaxy. They wanted to teach one last lesson about the difference between preservation and life. Hansel published his findings. The document spread through academic circles, then to the general public, then to the Galactic Assembly. The conservative factions were shocked into silence. The Vani elders, whom they all claimed to respect so deeply, had explicitly wanted humans to do exactly what they were doing. How could they argue against the direct wishes of the deceased? But some tried anyway. The elders were dying. One delegate argued. They weren't thinking clearly. We know better than they did what's good for their culture. You stood up in the assembly hall. So you're saying we should ignore what the Vani wanted because you know better than them? You're saying your desire to preserve their culture perfectly is more important than their desire to see it grow? The delegate had no answer. A young Alani scholar spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. I read the Human's translation of Anani philosophy. They believe that clinging to the past prevents growth. They believe that perfect preservation is another word for death. They believe that the only way to truly honor someone who died is to let their ideas keep living, keep changing, keep growing. An old Alani elder hissed at her. You've been corrupted by human thinking. No, the young scholar said firmly. I've been educated by Vani thinking. Humans were just the ones brave enough to actually learn it. The awakening could not be stopped. Young members of dozens of species began demanding access to the cultural artifacts their civilizations had locked away. They wanted to translate the untranslated texts. They wanted to study the unstudied art. They wanted to learn from the gifts that had been given to them. The old generation tried to resist. They passed laws protecting the artifacts. They claimed that only trained specialists could access them. They built more museums with thicker walls, but the young were persistent. And they had something the old generation didn't. They had seen what humanity created by learning from the heard the music. They had seen the buildings. They had read the new poetry that mixed human and concepts into something beautiful and new. They wanted that for their own cultures. They wanted to wake up their own dead. Nari continued teaching, traveling from world to world, more and more alien. Students attended her classes. They learned to read Vani poetry. They learned to understand Vani philosophy. And then they went home and asked, what are our ancestors trying to teach us? What did they want us to know? The galaxy was changing slowly, painfully, but changing, and deep in the archive, in files that humans hadn't Translated, the elders had written one more prediction when the young finally question their elders about why they bury the past instead of learning from it. The true awakening will begin, and the humans, the strange young species we barely knew, will have given the galaxy a gift as valuable as the one we gave them. 10 years had passed since they died. Geo was older now. His hair had turned gray and his back hurt when he stood too long, but he still served as Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Assembly. He had watched the galaxy change over the past decade, and sometimes he could hardly believe what he was seeing. The assembly station was different now. The grand hall where species once argued about preserving the past had become a place where they discussed how to learn from it. 23 species had opened their sealed archives. They had begun translating texts from extinct civilizations. They had started studying art that had sat untouched for thousands of years. The old museums were being slowly transformed. Some became research centers, some became schools. Artifacts behind glass were being carefully documented, and then in many cases carefully studied by trained scholars who treated them with respect, but not with fear. It was happening slowly. The older generation still resisted, but they were dying as all generations do, and the young were taking their place. The young who had been taught by people like Nari, the young who had asked uncomfortable questions, the young who wanted to learn from the dead, not just remember them. Humanity had started something that could not be stopped, but today was special. Today was the day Jiho had been waiting for since this all began. He stood in a medical facility on the assembly station. Through a window he could see Jiwon, the lead geneticist, working with her team. They moved carefully around an incubation chamber that held humanity's most ambitious project yet. They had left behind more than just their archive. They had left genetic samples and storage facilities across their former territory. Most alien species had preserved these samples but done nothing with them. They saw them as sacred remains that should not be disturbed. Humanity saw them as seeds. Jiwon had spent 7 years working on the project. She had assembled a team of the best geneticists from Earth and several progressive alien species. They had studied biology. They had learned how DNA functioned. They had mapped every gene, understood every protein, decoded every biological system, and then they had asked the galaxy question, what if we could bring back one, not to replace their species, not to undo their extinction, but to create a living bridge between past and present, a child who could carry their culture forward. The conservative factions had exploded with rage. This is the ultimate disrespect. You cannot play with the genetics of a dead species. This is abomination. But the progressive factions, now including many of the younger generation, had supported the project. The Galactic Assembly had debated for 2 years. Finally, after consulting with religious leaders, philosophers, and ethicists from 40 species, they had voted to allow it. Voted passed by 73%. The incubation chamber opened. Jiwon reached inside and carefully lifted out a small being. She wrapped it in a soft blanket and turned to show Jiho. It was a baby, the firstborn in 10 years, possibly the last who would ever exist. Her skin shimmered with colors that had no name. Her large eyes blinked slowly as she looked around at a universe she had never seen before. She made a small sound, something between a chirp and a hum, and Geo felt his heart break and heal at the same time. "Hello, little one," Jai whispered. "Welcome to the galaxy." They had named her Valen. It was a name meaning hope that returns. The ceremony was planned for that evening. Representatives from every species in the assembly would attend. But first, Jiho spent time with Velen in a quiet room. He held her carefully, marveling at how light she was, how delicate. "Your people gave us a gift," he told her, knowing she couldn't understand yet. "They gave us their culture, their knowledge, their dreams. And we've tried our best to honor that gift. We've learned from it. We've grown from it. We've kept it alive." Velen chirped softly and wrapped one tiny claw around Jiho and LT Unk and GT's finger. "Today we give a gift back," Geo continued. "Not the same gift, something new, something that wouldn't exist without your people and ours working together." That evening the Grand Hall was packed with more beings than Jiho had ever seen there. Every seat was filled. Cameras broadcast the ceremony to billions across the galaxy. Jiho stood at the speaking platform, Velen sleeping in his arms. Jiwon stood beside him. Behind them, a massive display showed what humanity had created over the past 10 years, images of human art, music that combined both cultures, buildings that used mathematics, scientific papers that built Oni discoveries, poetry written in a hybrid language that could only exist because humans had learned to think partly like. But there was more. There were images of young Krovan studying WH texts that their species had kept locked away for 5,000 years. There were recordings of Alani musicians playing CRE instruments that hadn't made sound in 8,000 years. There were videos of Sani artists creating new works based on ancient designs from extinct species. The awakening had spread. The galaxy was learning to let the dead teach them. 10 years ago, Jiho said, his voice carrying through the hall, the Veleni gave humanity their archive. Many of you thought we would damage it. Many of you thought we would disrespect it. Many of you thought we weren't worthy of such a gift. He paused and looked out at the sea of alien faces. You were right to worry. We did change the archive. We took it apart. We questioned it. We argued with it. We mixed it with our own culture. We didn't preserve it perfectly. He gestured to the images behind him, but we kept it alive. And in doing so, we started asking questions that made the rest of you uncomfortable. Questions about what it means to honor the dead. Questions about whether perfect preservation is the same as respect. Questions about what the dead would actually want. A young Krovan scholar stood up. Her name was Kree and she had been one of Nar's first students. "I want to thank humanity," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Before the humans came, my species kept the gifts from dead civilizations locked away. We told ourselves we were being respectful, but we were really just being afraid. Afraid to touch them, afraid to chain them, afraid to learn from them." She looked around the hall. The humans showed us a different way. They showed us that the best way to honor someone who has died is to learn everything they can teach us, to take their wisdom and build on it, to mix their culture with ours and create something new. Other voices joined hers. Young aliens from different species stood up and shared their stories, how they had studied texts their species had kept buried, how they had learned from cultures that had been dead for millennia. how they had discovered beauty and knowledge their species had been too afraid to seek. The older generation sat quietly. Some looked angry, some looked thoughtful, some looked sad, as if they were realizing what they had missed by keeping the past locked away. Jiho let them speak. He let the young tell their stories. Then finally he held up Villain for everyone to see. This is Valen, he said. She is the first Velani born in a decade. She may be the last. We created her from genetic samples her ancestors left behind. Some of you think this is wrong. Some of you think we're playing God. Some of you think we're violating the sacred rest of the dead. He looked down at the sleeping baby, but the Vani didn't want to rest. They wanted to teach. They wanted to grow. They wanted their culture to live on, not as a museum piece, but as a living, changing, growing thing. Jiho walked to the center of the hall. Pedestal rose from the floor. On its archive of eternal memory, the crystal that had started everything, Thay gave this archive to humanity to keep safe. Jiho said, "We've done that, but we've done more than that. We've studied it. We've learned from it. We've added to it." He touched the crystal and it projected images into the air. The original archive had contained 800,000 years of Vellani culture, but now it was bigger. Humans had added their own contributions. 10 years of new music, composed in Vellani style, new poetry, written in the language, new art created, using Vani principles, new scientific discoveries built on Vani foundations. The archive had grown. It was no longer just Ani. It was Vani and human. It was a living culture, not a dead one. The archive belongs to Valen now, Jiho said. It belongs to her people, even though she's the only one left, but it's not the same archive the Vani gave us. It's bigger, it's different, it contains ideas and art and knowledge that the ancient never created. It's what happens when you let a culture live instead of preserving it in amber. He placed Valen's tiny claw on the crystal. It hummed, recognizing Vani DNA, accepting the new guardian of its knowledge. Valen opened her eyes. Jiho had arranged for her to receive the neural training that humans had developed. Even as a baby, her brain was already forming the pathways that would let her understand both and human ways of thinking. She would grow up able to read the archive naturally, but also able to understand human concepts. She would be a bridge between species, between past and future. We returned the archive to the Vani, Jiho said, but it's not the same gift they gave us. It's bigger now. It's alive, and it will keep growing as long as someone keeps learning from it. The hall was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, beings began to stand. First the young,